The alien queen sat upon her golden throne, her large, piercing eyes scanning the chaos unfolding around her. The royal palace, once a place of harmony and order, now seemed like a battleground. The air was filled with the sounds of her children, wild, unruly, and uncontrollable. No matter how many nannies she hired, none of them could handle the royal brood. Each one had been fired after just a few days or weeks, their efforts in vain. It had all started 2 months ago when the queen decided to bring in the best of the best. She had selected nannies from all corners of her vast empire, powerful aliens from planets with advanced technologies, gifted beings with abilities beyond human comprehension. She thought that surely, with all their skills and knowledge, they would be able to tame her children. But she was wrong. The children, born with extraordinary powers, were too much for anyone to control. The first nanny, a telepathic alien, had been fired after just 3 days. The children had discovered her mental powers and began playing tricks on her mind, making her see things that weren't there. Soon, the nanny was so disoriented that she couldn't even perform her duties. The second nanny, a tough warrior from a distant planet, lasted a bit longer. She tried to discipline the children with physical training, but the children retaliated with force. One of them, a young girl, used her telekinetic powers to lift the nanny into the air and throw her across the room. The nanny had no choice but to resign, humiliated. One by one, the nannies were dismissed. Some were too soft, unable to assert authority over the children. Others tried too hard, using brute force, which only made things worse. The queen's frustration grew with each failed attempt. Her advisors, once hopeful that the perfect nanny would eventually be found, began to lose hope. The queen's face was pale, a frown permanently etched on her features. She had spent centuries ruling with wisdom and grace, yet now she felt helpless. Her children were her greatest responsibility, but they seemed impossible to control. Each time she thought she had found the right person to care for them, something went wrong. Her advisors whispered among themselves, but she could hear the doubt in their voices. They were beginning to question her judgment. "Your Majesty, perhaps we need to reconsider," one of her advisors suggested cautiously. "Maybe we need a more unconventional approach." The queen narrowed her eyes. "Unconventional," she repeated, her voice sharp. "I mean no disrespect," the advisor stammered, "but maybe it's time we think outside the box. Perhaps there is someone who doesn't come from the usual pool of candidates." The queen stood up, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and desperation. "And who exactly do you suggest?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. The advisor hesitated before speaking again. "Perhaps a human." The queen stared at him in disbelief. "A human? You think a mere human could handle my royal children?" The advisor nodded. "It's just a suggestion. We have heard rumors of human resilience and adaptability. Maybe someone who isn't part of the royal system could bring a fresh perspective." The queen scoffed, dismissing the idea. But as she sat back down, she couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. Was there a human somewhere who could do what her best aliens could not? She had nothing to lose at this point. After all, the fate of her royal family rested in her hands, and the thought of another nanny failure was simply unacceptable. In the back of her mind, she began to wonder if perhaps the answer was closer than she thought. As she gazed out of the palace windows, the sun setting on her alien world, the queen made a decision. She would give the idea a chance. The next morning, she would find this human and bring them to the palace. If anyone could handle her children, it had to be someone who wasn't afraid to think differently. Little did she know, the solution to her problem was about to walk into her life in the most unexpected way. John had never imagined he'd find himself in the royal palace of an alien queen. His days were simple, spent mopping floors, cleaning corridors, and keeping the palace neat and tidy. A humble janitor, he went unnoticed by most of the royal staff, his life unremarkable, yet stable. But that all changed when he overheard a conversation that would alter the course of his life forever. It was the late afternoon, and the palace was quieter than usual. The usual hustle and bustle of royal duties had settled into a strange stillness. John was finishing his cleaning duties near the throne room when he heard voices coming from behind the heavy golden doors. He knew better than to eavesdrop, but something about the tension in the voices made him stop. "I can't believe we're considering this," one of the advisors muttered. 15 nannies fired in 2 months. The Queen's patience is wearing thin. John peeked through a small gap in the door, careful not to make a sound. Inside, the Queen was standing by the window, looking out over the alien world. Her advisors were gathered around her, discussing matters that clearly weighed heavily on her mind. "She's desperate," another advisor said, shaking his head. "But who else could possibly handle those children? We've tried the best of the best telepaths, warriors, and scholars. Nothing works." The Queen's voice was cold and sharp. Perhaps we need someone new. Someone who doesn't come from our usual world. Maybe someone different." John's heart raced. He had no idea what they meant by someone different, but it felt like the conversation was turning towards something big. As the advisors continued their discussions, John barely breathed, trying to remain hidden. He had no idea why he was so drawn to this conversation. He was just a janitor after all. But something about the Queen's words left an impression on him. She needed someone different. When the conversation finally ended and the doors opened, John quickly ducked out of sight, heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was his chance to be more than just a janitor. He had no experience with children, let alone alien children with powers beyond anything he could imagine. But the words of the advisors lingered in his mind. Someone different. That night, as John lay in his small, sparse room within the palace, he couldn't sleep. The flickering light of the alien moon outside his window illuminated his restless thoughts. He thought of his daughter back home on Earth. His heart ached at the thought of her growing up without a father present. But what if this was the opportunity he had been waiting for? What if he could do something more than clean floors? What if he could actually make a difference? He couldn't get the idea out of his head. The Queen's children were out of control, and no one had been able to handle them. But what if he, with his human perspective, could? After all, what did he have to lose? He was a single dad, struggling to make ends meet. If the Queen gave him this opportunity, maybe he could prove himself worthy of something more. In the days that followed, John began to notice strange things around the palace. Alien creatures with glowing eyes, strange gadgets humming with power, and whispers of a new task that the Queen was looking for someone to handle. He knew it was only a matter of time before the offer came. He just had to be ready. The opportunity arrived sooner than he expected. Late one evening, a royal messenger appeared at his small quarters with an official summons. John's heart skipped a beat as he read the words, "The Queen requires your services. You are to meet with her at once." With trembling hands, John folded the letter, took a deep breath, and headed towards the palace's grand hall. What he didn't know was that this meeting would be the start of a journey that would test every ounce of his patience, courage, and determination. But one thing was for certain: he was ready to face. John stood at the entrance of the royal nursery, the massive double doors towering before him like a wall. The air inside felt heavy with tension, and he could already hear the chaotic sounds of alien laughter, shouts, and occasional crashes. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it, his chance to prove that he was more than just a janitor. He was nervous, but he tried to steady his breathing. The Queen had asked for him, and though he didn't fully understand why, he wasn't about to back down now. After all, what was the worst that could happen? He wasn't here to fail. He was here to succeed. As he pushed the doors open, the sight before him took him by surprise. The nursery was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The walls were adorned with holographic projections of distant galaxies and strange, colorful landscapes. Alien toys floated mid-air, held up by some unseen force. A giant, soft bed hovered in the center of the room, surrounded by floating pillows. But what caught John's attention most was the children, 3 of them, sitting on the floor, surrounded by what seemed like a mess of scattered objects. The oldest, a girl with glowing purple eyes, looked up at him with a mischievous grin. The youngest, a boy who looked barely 3, was levitating small toys, tossing them in the air and giggling as they spun in circles. The third, a baby with translucent skin and sharp, pointy ears, gurgled happily, floating above a pile of pillows like a little star. John felt a wave of panic rush over him. These weren't just any kids, they were extraordinary. They were aliens with powers that seemed completely beyond his comprehension. He had no idea how to deal with them. One of the children he couldn't tell which stared at him, narrowing their eyes. "Human," the child said in a voice that sounded too mature for their age. "What are you going to do?" John swallowed hard. I'm here to help," he managed to say, his voice a little shakier than he would have liked. The children giggled, as if they had just heard the funniest joke in the world. The girl with the glowing eyes stood up and floated a few inches off the ground, her smile playful yet challenging. "Help, you can't even clean this room properly." John's face flushed with embarrassment. This was not going how he had imagined, but he was determined. "I might not be the best at keeping things tidy, but I know how to deal with chaos," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. The girl snickered, floating over to him. "Chaos, this is fun. We don't need a boring human to ruin it." Before John could respond, the boy with the floating toys suddenly raised his hand, and the toys flew straight at him. Instinctively, John ducked, but a toy managed to graze his cheek. The children burst into laughter, clearly finding the whole situation amusing. John stood up, wiping the toy residue off his face, feeling more like a fool than ever. But he wasn't giving up. He could see the Queen's expectations were high, and if he wanted to make this work, he had to find a way to turn things around. He couldn't let these alien children see him as just a joke. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward them, trying his best to look confident. "Listen, I'm not here to play," he said firmly, "but I am here to make sure things don't get out of hand." The children stopped laughing for a moment, intrigued by his boldness. The girl tilted her head, as if considering his words. "You think you can control us, human?" she asked, her tone teasing yet curious. "I don't want to control you," John replied, his voice steadying. "But I do want to help. I want to show you that we can have fun and still get things done without causing chaos." The room fell silent for a moment, and John felt the weight of their gaze upon him. The children were powerful, far beyond anything he could have imagined. But there was something in his words that seemed to make them pause. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and moments where John would want to give up. But at that moment, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving without at least trying. And with that, the challenge began. John quickly realized that dealing with the royal children wasn't just about setting boundaries. It was a battle of wits, patience, and willpower. The kids, though small, were far from innocent. They were alien beings with abilities that defied logic. The older girl could manipulate objects with her mind. The young boy had a strange, almost magical way of altering the laws of physics. And the baby, well, the baby seemed to be able to read minds. The first few days were a blur of misfires and failures. Every time John thought he had a handle on the situation, something new and unexpected would happen. One morning, as he tried to organize the room, the girl levitated the furniture, sending it floating toward the ceiling. As the chairs banged against the walls, John tried to shout over the noise, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of chaos. "Stop," he ordered, his frustration building. "We can't do this every day." But the children just giggled, their eyes glowing with mischief. They were toying with him, pushing him to his limits, and each time he faltered, they sensed it, using their powers to intensify their tricks. John's temper was starting to fray. His patience, once a strength, was now being tested in ways he never thought possible. He knew he had to regain control before the Queen found out about his failures. But how could he? The children seemed impervious to any form of discipline, their alien powers making them untouchable. One evening, after another long day of chaos, John found himself sitting in the quiet of the royal hallway, feeling utterly defeated. He ran a hand through his hair, wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The Queen would surely have him dismissed. She couldn't afford another failure. But then, as he sat in the dim light, he remembered something his own father had told him. Sometimes, you don't win by being the strongest. You win by being the one who never quits. John stood up, a renewed sense of determination flooding his chest. He had to stop seeing the children's powers as obstacles. They were a challenge, yes, but also an opportunity. They weren't just out of control, they were searching for something. They were testing him, waiting to see if he would stand his ground. The next day, instead of trying to force order on them, he did something unexpected. He walked into the nursery with a calm smile and a new approach. "Let's make a deal," he said, his voice steady. "I'll help you have fun, but only if we can agree on some rules." The children stopped their play and looked at him, intrigued. For the first time, they didn't see him as a joke. They saw him as someone who was ready to engage with them on their level. The girl floated down from her perch, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "What kind of rules?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. "Simple ones," John replied. "No more throwing furniture, no mind tricks on me, and no using your powers to make me look foolish." The boy, who had been juggling a floating ball, stopped and tilted his head. "And what do we get?" "You get to do whatever you want within reason," John said, giving them a wink. "But only if we can keep things from getting out of hand." "Deal." For a moment, the room was silent. The children exchanged glances, their alien minds working in tandem. John could feel the tension in the air. This was his moment. If he could convince them to agree to these simple terms, he might just win their respect. Finally, the girl floated down to his eye level. "Deal," she said with a mischievous grin. "But only because we like you human." John let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the first time since he had started this strange job, he felt like he had gained their trust. He wasn't just some janitor anymore, he was someone they were willing to work with. As the days went on, John found himself gaining more and more ground. The children, while still mischievous, began to follow the rules. He made a habit of rewarding their good behavior with games and challenges, using their alien abilities to create fun activities. Slowly but surely, the children started to respect him. They were still unpredictable, but John was no longer seen as an outsider. He was now a part of their world, and they were beginning to listen. The palace, once filled with chaos, was starting to feel a little more like home. But John knew this was just the beginning. The queen would soon return, and he would have to prove that he was capable of more than just keeping the children entertained. He had to prove that he could truly take care of them. And with each passing day, John grew more confident that he might just be the one to succeed where 15 others had failed. The days passed, and John's newfound confidence grew with each challenge he faced. He had established some semblance of order in the royal nursery. Though the children still had their moments of mischief, the girl often floated about, teasing him with her telekinetic abilities, and the boy would shift the furniture with a snap of his fingers, just to see if he'd react. Yet, despite their tricks, something had changed. John wasn't losing his patience anymore. He had learned how to play along, how to meet their chaos with calmness, and in turn, they started to respect him. But the real test came one afternoon when the Queen's advisors arrived to check on his progress. The children, sensing the seriousness of the situation, decided to have one last laugh. The moment the advisors entered, the youngest child, who had been quiet for days, suddenly began to levitate the entire furniture. Chairs and tables spun in midair like toys. The Queen's advisors gasped, clearly startled. John stood frozen, unsure of how to handle the escalating situation. "What's going on here?" one of the advisors asked, his eyes darting from the floating objects to John. John remained calm. He couldn't let them see how nervous he was. "Just a little game," he said, forcing a smile. "I've been trying to teach them some structure, but they're still learning." The advisors exchanged skeptical glances. They had seen the chaos firsthand, and they were ready to dismiss him. The Queen had given him a trial, but the advisors weren't so sure a human could manage her royal children. The Queen herself had never been easy to please, and they feared this experiment might be another failure. They watched closely, waiting for him to slip up, but John wasn't about to let that happen. With a deep breath, he addressed the children in a soft, yet firm voice. "All right, that's enough now," he said, his tone steady. "You've had your fun. Let's get things back to normal." The children paused, sensing the seriousness in his voice. Slowly, the floating objects descended back to the ground. The room fell silent, and for a moment, even the advisors seemed unsure of what to make of the scene. The children weren't causing chaos anymore. Instead, they were watching John closely, waiting for his next move. "You see," John continued, turning to the advisors with a reassuring smile, "it's all about balance. I don't need to control them, just guide them. They're learning the value of self-discipline through play. They respond to patience, not punishment. The advisors exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected to see failure, but John's calm demeanor and ability to manage the children left them speechless. The Queen's children had always been uncontrollable, but here was a human, a janitor, no less, who had managed to bring some semblance of order to the chaos. It was unthinkable, but it was happening. One of the advisors finally spoke, his voice hesitant. Perhaps we were wrong to doubt your methods. It seems you've managed to accomplish more than we expected. John nodded, not letting the praise go to his head. I'm just doing my best. I'm here to help, not to be their enemy. The room was still quiet for a moment, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a moment of respect, something John hadn't expected to earn so soon. But as the advisors left, one lingering thought echoed in his mind. The real test was yet to come. The Queen herself. The Queen had been distant these past few weeks, watching from afar but never fully engaging. She had given him a chance, but would she believe in his success? Would she recognize his efforts? John knew the stakes were high. This was his moment to prove himself, not just to the children, but to the Queen. As the advisors departed, John turned to the children, who had already returned to their playful ways. The girl floated a little too close to him, her eyes gleaming with mischief. So, human, she teased, think you can handle us for real now? John smirked, meeting her gaze. You bet I can. And with that, the tension that had been building for weeks started to fade. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. The air inside the royal palace was thick with anticipation as the day of the invasion drew near. John had never imagined his new life would lead to such a moment. Just when he thought he was starting to make headway with the royal children, the palace was thrown into chaos once again, but this time, it wasn't from misbehaving children. The real threat was far more dangerous. The Queen had received news of an impending invasion. A powerful force from a distant star system was on its way, and they had set their sights on the royal palace. John had no idea how the palace could defend itself against such a threat, especially with so many alien powers in the mix. What good would his experience with a handful of unruly children do now? The Queen had ordered her guards and soldiers to prepare for battle, but John knew that the real challenge lay in protecting the children. With the palace in lockdown and soldiers gearing up for a fight, John found himself alone in the nursery, watching over the royal brood. The children sensed the change in the air. The laughter and games had stopped, replaced by a quiet intensity. They knew something big was happening, but they didn't fully understand it. For a moment, John thought of retreating, of finding some safe corner in the palace where he could hide. But he couldn't. He had come this far, and the thought of leaving the children alone in the face of danger wasn't an option. No matter how wild or unpredictable they had been, they were still his responsibility now. As the first signs of the alien invasion appeared on the horizon, John stood at the window, looking out over the alien landscape. The sky was streaked with crimson, and distant ships could be seen hovering like dark shadows against the setting sun. His heart raced as he thought about the Queen, preparing for battle, but for the first time, he realized that he was part of something much bigger now. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a protector. The children had gathered around him, their eyes wide with curiosity. The youngest one floated near him, sensing his anxiety. For a moment, the room was still, and then, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, the girl with glowing eyes spoke. Her voice low and serious. Will we be safe? She asked, her gaze never leaving his face. John swallowed hard, fighting to keep his voice steady. We're going to be fine, he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. I won't let anything happen to you. The boy, who had been mostly quiet, floated in front of John, his face unusually solemn. You're the one in charge now, he said. The Queen trusts you. The words hit John harder than he expected. He had come here to clean floors, to keep the palace tidy, and yet here he was, standing between these children and an alien invasion. The weight of responsibility was suffocating, but he couldn't back down. Not now. The baby, still small, but already showing signs of power, floated up to him and reached out, placing a tiny hand on his shoulder. The connection felt more than physical. It was as if the child was offering him some unspoken strength, a promise that they weren't as helpless as they appeared. A loud crash from outside snapped John from his thoughts. The invasion was upon them. He could hear the distant sounds of battle echoing through the palace walls. The ground trembled as explosions rocked the palace, shaking the foundation beneath his feet. The children looked up at him, their expressions filled with both fear and trust. Without thinking, John took charge. "Stay close to me," he ordered, his voice firm. "We need to get to a safer place, now." The dust had barely settled from the battle when John found himself standing in the heart of the royal palace, surrounded by the very children he had once feared he couldn't control. The invasion was over. The alien forces had retreated, and the palace, though scarred, had survived. But John knew the real victory wasn't in the walls still standing, it was in the children, who now looked to him with trust in their eyes. The Queen had been the first to congratulate him, her voice filled with a rare warmth. "You've done what no one else could, John," she said, her gaze lingering on him with a newfound respect. "You've proven yourself not just as a caretaker, but as a protector. The palace is safe, and for that, we owe you more than words can say." John had never expected to hear such praise from her. He had come to the palace as nothing more than a janitor, a single dad struggling to make ends meet. Yet here he was, standing in the midst of royalty, having done what no one else could, not only saving the children, but also earning their respect. The children, once wild and uncontrollable, now sat calmly beside him, their once mischievous eyes softened with admiration. The girl with the glowing purple eyes, who had tormented him in the early days, now looked at him like a sibling, her gaze filled with a quiet understanding. The young boy, whose playful antics had once made him an unrelenting challenge, now looked to John for guidance, his telekinetic abilities no longer a weapon, but a gift they could use together. And the baby, still small but strong, floated in John's arms as if to say, "I trust you." John didn't know how it had happened, how the chaos, the frustration, and the fear had turned into something resembling family. But he was no longer the outsider. He was part of their world now, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. The Queen, observing the bond between John and her children, spoke again. "You've shown me something I never expected. I thought I needed someone powerful, someone like us, someone from my world. But I see now that it was you, a human, who was the answer all along." John's heart swelled at her words, but he didn't know what to say. He had never asked for any of this. All he wanted was to be a good father, to provide for his daughter back on Earth. But here he was, in an alien world, standing at the center of something far greater than he had ever imagined. "You've earned your place here," the Queen continued, "not just as a caretaker, but as a member of this family. You're not just my janitor anymore, John. You're the royal guardian, and you will have a place in our court, if you wish." John felt the weight of the offer, but more than anything, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was more than a job. This was more than survival. It was a testament to the power of human resilience, and to the bond that could form between species, no matter how different they seemed. As the evening wore on, the palace returned to a quieter rhythm, but the air was different. The children were laughing, playing in ways they had never done before, no longer with reckless abandon, but with a sense of security that John had fought hard to give them. The Queen, though still the ruler, seemed lighter, almost at peace. And John was no longer the man who had walked into the palace just weeks ago, uncertain of his place in the universe. He had found his purpose. Later that night, as he tucked the children into their floating beds, John couldn't help but smile. They weren't just royal children, alien beings with unimaginable powers. They were children who had found a protector in him. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was their guardian, their friend, their family. And as he stood there, watching over them, he realized that he had found something even more precious than his own survival. He had found a home,